Presenting yin and yang for feng shui, traditional Chinese medicine, the martial arts, and the I Ching. Part 4, Recent Archaeology and the I Ching. These are my four mothers and my female lineage. That baby is my mother in 1926. Her mother is 25 years old, her grandmother 50, and her great-grandmother is 67 years old. Her great-great-grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, was 95 when this photo was taken. The baby's mother lived to be 106 years old. And this is me. Please visit the other installments in the series. Part 1, Yin, Yang, and the Center. Part 2, Stories of the I Ching. Part 3, Deconstructing the Later Heaven Bagua. Part 4, Recent Archaeology and the I Ching. Chinese archaeology rivals the wonders of Egypt, the Maya, and ancient Greece and Rome, but knowledge about it was forbidden, first by the burning of the books in China around 200 BC, and then by doubt that this golden age ever existed. Recent developments in Chinese archaeology reveal the long-hidden truth about ancient China. The most dynamic time in Chinese history was coming to a close. The great works of Confucius, Mencius, and Laozi were about to be lost, perhaps forever. It was the Warring States period, and all the states of China were constantly at war. The individual states began to repeatedly form alliances and then break up again. It was just as shocking then as if individual U.S. states began to break up or take each other over, all while claiming allegiance to the central power, in this case, the Zhou dynasty. There was an arms race between the states of the discovery of iron, and a thought race. Each individual Chinese state developed its own theory of war and its own writing system, in which were written the great works of Chinese literature that we still enjoy today. Much like the Renaissance in Italy, it was a time of great thinkers who were employed in turn by the competing states. These were the Renaissance men of China. The I Ching book flourished and even had a spin-off, but these famous works did not survive. The state of war between the Chinese states ended, and with it, these great works of literature were destroyed. After 250 years of war, the Qin state, famous for the terracotta warriors, was triumphant. This is the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. He then used an iron hand to unify China, establishing standard weights and measures, currency, and 6,000 kilometers of highways. These standards are still in use today, and these great achievements and consolidation are why people still call it China, or China, named after the Qin people who unified the great country of China. They say the Qin Empire burned the books, but they didn't need to. As final winner of the wars in pre-imperial China, they simply changed to their own writing system. It was a data apocalypse. Suddenly, all the individual state writing systems and the knowledge they contained became as obsolete as a 3-inch floppy disk or an old 78 RPM blues record from the 30s. The tragic loss was all the knowledge that had been recorded to that point. Great works of philosophy, literature, and history were destroyed, including the original versions of the I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, and the Confucian classics. That is why there remains a gap about what happened before the Qin dynasty came to power. The iron rule of the Qin dynasty was soon thrown off in a civil war. The next imperial dynasty to take the stage was ruled by the Han people. The Han Chinese lamented the loss of the books and culture. Sima Qian, the great historian of the Han dynasty, spent his life reconstructing as much of the lost history as he could. He tried to rewrite the entire Chinese canon painstakingly by interviewing the survivors of the Qin dynasty. These reconstructed documents come down to us through 2,000 years of history, But after hundreds of years of recopying, scholars began to wonder, are these accurate? Some thought for the ancient documents to survive would be impossible, and so they must be forgeries. The Han did attempt to reconstruct the lost knowledge, but how much were they able to recover, and how much did they just make up? The great inspiration for this series on ancient China is the I Ching. It's a book of wisdom accessed by tossing coins or sticks at random. As a work of literature, it stands on its own, and it describes the process of change that permeates the universe, and it discusses various elements of change and timing. To use it as an oracle, toss coins or sticks to arrive at one of the 64 hexagram images. Next, consider the image to see if it inspires insight or maybe a different perspective. The I Ching generally suggests both prudent action and correct timing, and so it's great for all ages, for both casual use and serious consultation. The underlying structure of the I Ching is a sacred numerological system with roots in the Neolithic Chinese tradition. The yin and yang lines of the I Ching are a type of binary notation, the same basic and universal numbering system that was sent as a message to outer space on the Voyager probe. No one knows for sure how it came to be written. The I Ching book we use today is practically identical to one in use during the Han Dynasty. According to the great historian of Han, it was written by a much earlier group, the Zhou kings of the Zhou dynasty. The stories in the I Ching center around the legends of the Zhou and how they came into power. According to the legend, the book was written by the first Zhou king, King Wen, and his son, the Duke of Zhou. The I Ching was a secret of their successful and powerful dynasty, and it's rumored that generations later, when the Zhou lost control of the book, their power declined. The Zhou had a reputation for being righteous and fair, and they were held as an example of great leadership for the rest of Chinese history. The sage Confucius revered the I Ching. His extensive commentary has been considered a part of the I Ching for 2,000 years. We know for sure the version of the I Ching book we read today goes back to the Han Dynasty in the year 206 BC. Before that, the trail goes cold. The mystery is, if the book was written by the Zhou people and their dynasty, how did it cross 1,000 years of history from the Zhou people's time to the Han era? Is it really a Zhou artifact, or was it written later by the Han about the Zhou? Beginning with the discovery made in 1899, Chinese archaeologists have begun to answer these and other questions. The first thrilling discovery of ancient China was made at Anyang. This was the first discovery of ancient Chinese writing, called oracle bones. Incredibly, it proved the existence of the writing system used by the Zhou authors of the I Ching. It wasn't much publicized because China had bigger problems at the time. After rejecting the ancient imperial system that had lasted 557 generations, the Chinese people were struggling together to become a Chinese republic and eventually the communist state in 1949. The communist government did not want to hear about ancient China. They were leaving this history and this old Chinese culture behind, and they were creating a new Chinese culture. When Chairman Mao died in 1976, China began to emerge from the Cultural Revolution, and the greatest finds of Chinese archaeology started coming to light. In 1976, an army of 6,000 terracotta warriors were discovered, each with individually crafted facial features and costume. Before long, they realized it was the 210 BC burial of the Qin Emperor, credited with unifying China. This discovery marked the beginning of a golden era in Chinese archaeology. Also in 1976 was discovered, buried deep in the ground, the crypt of Lady Fu Hao from over 3,000 years ago. Long before the I Ching was written, This was the most famous wife of the powerful Shang dynasty king Wu Ding. According to records pieced together on ancient bones and bronzeware, she was a mighty general in her own right. Together, Wu Ding and Lady Hao expanded Shang territory extensively. Lady Hao had 9 children. She was a top-tier general, and she also had a collection of ancient Chinese artifacts of her own. Thanks to its great depth, it was one of the most complete grave sites ever found. It contained thousands of priceless jades and bronzes. This discovery brought fame and interest to 20th century Chinese archaeology. Now, here's a find related to the I Ching. At the time it was found in 1973, this Mawang Dui find was the first Han-era copy of the I Ching to be unearthed. It proves the Han in 168 BC already had an I Ching similar to what we still read today. This was the grave of a scholar who had many documents, including the Tao Te Ching, the I Ching, and the Confucian classics, written on bamboo and silk. I Ching scholars find it very significant that this is the earliest archaeological indication of trigrams. The greater part of today's I Ching book consists of commentaries attributed to Confucius. He was an influencer and a philosopher of the Chinese spring and autumn period, and Mencius continued his work 2 generations later. They both idealized the ancient authors of the I Ching, the Zhou people. They saw that Chinese culture was becoming increasingly warlike, and they worried about it, so they taught their disciples about the Zhou people, who were righteous, fair, and moral. Confucius made extensive commentaries carried down in today's I Ching. But the question is, did Confucius ever live, let alone write the main commentary on the I Ching? In the context of communist China coming out of the Cultural Revolution, people doubted that Confucius even existed. They wondered whether Mencius was a historical figure. Even if Mencius was a historical figure, was his thought really based on that of Confucius? So that is a point of great interest in this study. Incredibly, the discovery of a bamboo book in 1993 called the Guo Dian bamboo slips dates back to 300 BC, which is squarely between the time of Confucius and Mencius, and presents us with a pre-Mencius Confucian tradition. It means that people were talking about Confucius long before Mencius added to his teachings. So it's a great proof of the existence of Confucius, and it backs up the claims of Confucian followers, including Mencius. There is a competing version of the I Ching called the Guikang that I discussed in part 2 of the series. Until 1993, it had been but a legend. This is an alternate, less optimistic version of the I Ching with the same numerological basis in hexagrams, but different stories attached. There had been a version that came down to us from the Han Dynasty, copied hand to hand from an excavation by the Han people in their time. Scholars had long suspected that it might be a forgery. They doubted that there had ever been such an alternate I Ching version. In 1993, archaeologists were surprised to discover a copy of it among the grave goods of a man who was buried in 228 BC. Because this discovery corresponds very closely to the questionable version, it proves not only the existence of the competing version of the I Ching, it also corroborates the version that we already had on hand. So far, we've been looking at finds from the Warring States period dating back to 300 BC. Now we turn the clock way back to finds from 1100 years BC. No books or documents survive from that time, but we have inscriptions on bone, bronze, and pottery. These spectacular finds date back to the dawn of Zhou dynasty. Here's an inscribed wine urn in bronze and an oracle bone, discovered in 1977. One of the peculiar things about the I Ching is it contains strings of 6 numbers called hexagrams, and they've found some hexagrams, one on this urn and one on this bone. It's a recent thing. They've realized that many of the artifacts have these hexagrams on them, and they are starting to look for them and finding more and more hexagrams on ancient artifacts that they never noticed before. It's very thrilling. This was the first indication that something like the I Ching existed way back in 1100 BC. Discovered in 2001. This is really something. This was a pestle-shaped object made of clay, and it was used in pottery production for forming pots. What's interesting is it has a pair of the 6 numbered figures called hexagrams. In those days, they didn't have so-called yin or yang lines yet. They used even and odd numbers. In the photo, you can see a horizontal line, which is a Chinese numeral 1 for yang lines, and a bent line, the numeral 6 for yin lines. These are 2 very special hexagrams because they fall at the end of the I Ching. They're called before completion and after completion. It means that in 1100 BC, at the dawn of the Zhou dynasty, they had hexagrams. Here's another pestle-shaped object. 4 hexagrams were discovered displayed across the pestle. It's hard to see, and part of it crumbled off, but the arrows point to a vertical hexagram, then a horizontal, a vertical, and then a horizontal one. Turns out these correspond to 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th hexagrams, and they are in the so-called King Wen sequence. Until this discovery was made, people wondered, is the King Wen sequence historically valid? And if so, does it really date back to King Wen and the founding of the Zhou dynasty? This discovery supports the idea of a King Wen sequence and an I Ching tradition dating back to the beginning of the Zhou dynasty, about 1100 BC. Finally, this is a sketch copied from a bone, an oracle bone, that was discovered in 2001, dating back to 1100 BC. It's a series of 3 requests and 3 responses reached by divination. So these aren't just decorative hexagrams, these are divinations, very similar to the way people still divine with the I Ching in China today. The first one, on the right, a request. Would that he improve. A patient is not feeling well, so a shaman or doctor has made a divination. They make the request, write it down, and then they write an answering hexagram by tossing coins or sorting yarrow sticks. They did it 3 times on this bone. It means people were divining and coming up with hexagrams back in 1100 BC, and it proves that the I Ching, or hexagrams like those found in the I Ching, were in use 3,000 years ago at the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. These archaeological discoveries confirm many of the legends in and around the I Ching book. We all owe a debt of thanks to the great historian for his diligent and long-lasting work. Thank you for watching, and be sure to watch the rest of the series, Yin and Yang for Feng Shui, Traditional Chinese Medicine, the Martial Arts, and the I Ching. Acknowledgement. All these finds are listed in a book called Unearthing the Changes by Edward L. Shaughnessy, the professor of early Chinese studies at the University of Chicago. In it, he makes a detailed study and analysis of some of the bamboo books found in ancient burials. As an introduction, he provides a short history of modern Chinese archaeology as it pertains to the I Ching. I appreciated reading this book so much, and I'm pleased to be able to share a small part of it with you.